My name is Serafina Croft, and the last words my father ever said to me in public were, "You can go now." It was at his retirement gala, a glittering affair held in a glass-walled pavilion overlooking the fog-swept majesty of the Golden Gate Bridge. The room was a constellation of San Francisco's elite, architects, venture capitalists, and the kind of old-money scions I'd known my whole life, people who smiled with their teeth but never their eyes. My father, Marcus Thorne, the visionary founder of Thorne and Sterling Architecture, had just taken the stage for his final address. For a moment, a hush fell, the city lights twinkling below like a fallen sky. He spoke of permanence, of structures that defy time, of legacy. Then he lifted his champagne flute, the crystal catching the light. To a legacy, he declared, his voice resonant with practiced authority, carried on by those who build, not those who dream. Two of my children have made me proud. The applause began, a wave of polite, percussive sound. But I felt the silence that followed it. He turned his head just so, his gaze sweeping past my brother and sister at the head table, and found me in the back near the catering station. His eyes, the same cool gray as the Pacific on a winter morning, settled on me. "You can go now, Serafina." He didn't shout. He didn't have to. The words were quiet, precise, a surgeon's cut. The clinking of glasses around me stuttered and stopped. The air grew thick with unspoken curiosity. My heart began a frantic, muffled drumbeat against my ribs. Shame, hot and familiar, washed over me. I had spent 32 years orbiting this man's sun, desperately seeking a sliver of his light, and with 3 words, he had cast me into the dark. I felt the familiar impulse to shrink, to disappear, to obey. But then, beside me, another chair scraped against the polished concrete floor. My husband, Leo, stood up, his presence a sudden, warm anchor in the cold room, and what he did next would not tear down my father's world, but would, for the first time, allow me to step out from its shadow and build my own. If you have ever felt like an exile in your own family, like your worth was a line item on someone else's ledger, then please, stay with this story. You need to hear what happened when Leo spoke, because that night, the foundation of my life finally cracked, not to collapse, but to let the light in. I grew up in a house that was more of a monument than a home. Perched on a cliffside in Sausalito, it was one of my father's early masterpieces, a symphony of glass, steel, and exposed concrete, with panoramic views of the bay. Tourists on the ferry would point their cameras at it. It was beautiful, celebrated, and cold to the touch. Inside, there was no clutter, no cozy corners, no sentimentality. Every object had its place, every surface was polished to a reflective sheen. It was a pressure cooker designed with impeccable taste. My father, Marcus Thorne, was a man who communicated in blueprints and hard lines. Affection was a poorly designed concept, inefficient and messy. His approval was the ultimate prize, awarded for quantifiable achievements. He sculpted the city's skyline and expected to sculpt his children with the same ruthless precision. My mother, Isabel, was the curator of this domestic museum. She was beautiful, graceful, and perpetually anxious, her life's work smoothing the sharp edges of my father's expectations. She would rearrange flowers, adjust throw pillows, and gently steer conversations away from dangerous topics, all in an effort to maintain a fragile peace. She never challenged him, not openly. Her rebellion was in small, secret gestures, a whispered, "That was a lovely drawing, sweetie," after my father had dismissed it as unstructured, a squeeze of my hand under the dinner table. When she died of a swift and cruel neurological disease the year I left for college, the last of the warmth in that glass house went with her, leaving me exposed to the chill. I was the youngest of 3 and the perpetual outlier. Damien, my brother, was the heir. He was groomed for venture capital from the day he mastered long division. Stanford undergrad, a stint at Goldman Sachs, then co-founding a boutique VC firm that funded the very tech giants whose towers were beginning to dwarf my father's architectural landmarks. He moved through the world with an unshakable, inherited confidence. My sister, Victoria, was the pragmatist. A cardiac surgeon, she saw life as a complex system to be diagnosed and managed. She'd followed the pre-med track at Berkeley with the same relentless focus she now applied to repairing human hearts. She treated family gatherings like medical consults, assessing our lives for weaknesses. And then there was me. I was the soft variable in their rigid equation. While they were at debate camp and science fairs, I was lost in the public library, my pockets full of overdue notices. I filled secret notebooks with poems and stories. I saw beauty in the cracked pavement and the wilting flower, things my father's world deemed imperfect and therefore irrelevant. He never understood my quiet rebellion, my fascination with the internal architecture of a story rather than the external architecture of a skyscraper. When I announced I was going to major in literature at a small liberal arts college in Oregon, he looked at me with genuine bewilderment. "And what is the return on investment for that, Serafina?" he'd asked. "There's no foundation in sentiment." When I couldn't answer in his language, he paid my first semester's tuition and then quietly withdrew all support. I scraped my way through college with scholarships, student loans, and a series of exhausting jobs: barista, library assistant, and late-night transcriptionist. In the quiet hours between shifts, surrounded by the smell of coffee and old paper, I discovered a different kind of ambition, one that wasn't about conquering or building empires, but about connecting and bearing witness. At 26, using the small inheritance my mother had secretly left me, I founded Hearthstone Press, a tiny independent publisher dedicated to debut works of fiction and poetry by voices the mainstream world so often ignored. Our first year, we published 2 books out of my small Berkeley apartment. By our 4th year, one of our poets was a finalist for the National Book Award. It wasn't a skyscraper, it wasn't a billion-dollar exit, but it was a home I had built for myself, word by word. Still, a part of me remained that girl in the glass house, straining to hear the one sentence he'd never uttered: "I'm proud of you." It was a foolish, stubborn hope. Damien once told me, not unkindly, that he'd never seen our father finish a work of fiction. "He doesn't have the patience for narratives he can't control," he'd said. I knew this, yet I kept waiting for him to read a single page of my life and see something of value. I met Leo in a dusty, sun-drenched bookstore on Telegraph Avenue. We both reached for the same worn copy of Mary Oliver's Devotions. He smiled, a slow, genuine smile that reached his eyes, and let me have it. He offered to buy me a cup of tea to make up for it. He was a public interest lawyer, working with housing rights activists in Oakland. He didn't ask about my business model, he asked about the stories I was helping to tell. He called Hearthstone Press a necessary act of compassion, and in that moment, I felt seen in a way I never had before. We were married 2 years later, under a canopy of ancient redwoods in Muirwoods, surrounded by a small group of our chosen family friends, authors, activists. My family's response was a study in their respective characters. Damien sent an expensive bottle of champagne with a note that read, "To new ventures." Victoria sent a text, "On call that weekend, but congratulations." My father sent nothing. I told myself it didn't matter, that this new life was my real life. But standing there, bathed in the dappled forest light, a small, sad part of me still scanned the crowd for his face. The invitation to the gala arrived on a thick, slate-gray card, the font a stark, elegant sans serif my father had commissioned for his firm. "Marcus Thorne invites you to celebrate a lifetime of achievement." I held it in my hands, the sharp corners digging into my palms. "It's a command performance," Leo said gently, reading my expression as he walked into the kitchen. "Maybe he wants to connect," I said, the old hope flickering. "Retirement is a big step. Maybe he's softening." Leo came up behind me and wrapped his arms around my waist, resting his chin on my shoulder. "Or maybe he wants to assemble everyone who matters to him so he can put a final, perfect capstone on his legacy." He paused. We don't have to go, Serafina. We could drive up the coast. Find a quiet beach. You don't owe him your peace. But the pull was there, that deep, gravitational force of a child's longing. I think I have to, I whispered. Just one last time. To close the book. The night before the gala, I lay awake, my body thrumming with a low-grade dread. It was the same feeling I used to get as a child before parent-teacher conferences, the sickening certainty that I was about to be weighed, measured, and found wanting. I was walking back into the monument, and I was afraid I would forget how to find my way out again. The day of the gala, I dressed with the care of someone preparing for a difficult negotiation. Not with my father, but with myself. I chose a dress the color of moss, a deep, velvety green that felt like the forests where I was happiest. It was soft, fluid, and unstructured, everything my childhood home was not. My makeup was minimal. I wanted to look like myself, not a version of myself armored for his approval. Before we left our small, book-cluttered bungalow in Berkeley, I stood before the hallway mirror, fussing with a stray piece of hair. Leo came and stood behind me, his reflection warm and steady next to my own. "Remember who you are," he said softly, his hands on my shoulders. "You are the founder of Hearthstone Press. You are the woman who champions the voiceless. You are more than his daughter." "I know," I said, my voice thin. But did I? A part of me still felt like that little girl, holding up a finger painting for a man who only saw the smudges. The familiar knot of anxiety tightened in my chest as we drove across the Bay Bridge, the city skyline rising before us like a glittering fortress. My breathing grew shallow. Leo, without a word, reached over and took my hand, his thumbs stroking my knuckles. "Breathe with me," he murmured, and I matched his slow, deep breaths until the city lights stopped swimming in my vision. "His opinion is just data, Serafina. It's not the truth." I nodded, clinging to his words like a mantra. The venue, a private event space called the Airy, was perched atop a new, minimalist tower downtown. It was exactly the kind of place my father would choose, breathtakingly beautiful and emotionally sterile. A silent, high-speed elevator lifted us to the top floor, opening into a vast room enclosed on 3 sides by floor-to-ceiling glass. The view was the main event. Below, the bay was a dark sheet of ink, the bridge a string of pearls draped against the encroaching fog. The air hummed with power. Men in bespoke suits and women in architectural jewelry clustered in small, important-looking groups. Servers wove through the crowd with trays of oysters and flutes of champagne. Damien found us first, materializing by the bar with a sleek, predatory grace. He kissed my cheek, a brief, dry touch. "Serafina, I'm surprised you came." He turned to the man next to him, a tech CEO whose face I recognized from a magazine. "This is my little sister. She runs a book club, is that right?" He smiled, as if he'd made a charming joke. Before I could correct him, he'd already pivoted back to a conversation about seed funding. I saw Victoria near a large, abstract sculpture, her posture as rigid and perfect as the steelwork. She was in a severe black dress that made her look like a beautiful, expensive weapon. She scanned me from head to toe. "Green," she noted, a clinical observation. "It's a bold choice." Her fiancé, another surgeon, shook my hand with a grip that felt like a diagnostic test. I made my excuses and moved away, the feeling of being an exotic, slightly disappointing species growing with every step. Every conversation I overheard was about market caps, property values, and IPOs. I felt like I was speaking a different language. And yet I stayed. Because that's the insidious power of a conditional upbringing. You're trained to keep returning to the source of the wound, hoping this time it will offer a balm instead of a blow. We found our table assignment on a large, backlit chart. Table 14. Tucked away in a corner with a partial view of the kitchen doors. Damien and Victoria were at table 1, flanking our father, alongside the mayor, the firm's new CEO, and a handful of key investors. Leo and I were seated with a distant cousin I hadn't seen in 20 years, an elderly former partner of my father's who seemed half asleep, and two junior architects who looked terrified to be there. The meal was an exercise in culinary perfection, seared scallops with a saffron reduction, followed by duck confit. It was exquisite, but I tasted nothing. The cousin, a woman named Dorothy, turned to me with bright, bird-like curiosity. "And what is it you do, dear?" "I run a small publishing house," I said. "Hearthstone Press." "Oh, how lovely," she chirped. "A little passion project. It's so important for women to have hobbies." I opened my mouth to explain about the awards, the grants, the lives we were changing, but the words wouldn't come. I just smiled, a tight, brittle thing. Under the table, Leo's hand found mine, a silent, steadying pressure. Across the cavernous room, my father was in his element, the center of gravity around which everything and everyone revolved. He laughed, he gestured, he accepted praise with the easy grace of a man who believes it is his due. He hadn't looked in my direction once. A few minutes later, a hand touched my arm. It was my father's sister, my Aunt Matilda. She was a taller, softer version of him, her elegance masking the same core of emotional granite. She smelled of Chanel No. 5 and disapproval. "Serafina, you look healthy," she said, her eyes flicking over my dress. She leaned in, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Do try to be invisible tonight, darling. This evening means the world to your father. You know how he values a seamless presentation." I stared at her, speechless. The implication was clear. I was a potential flaw in his perfect design. Before I could find my voice, she had already squeezed my arm and drifted away, leaving the scent of her perfume hanging in the air like a judgment. The lights dimmed. The speeches began. The new CEO praised my father's uncompromising vision. A famous architectural critic spoke of his genius for shaping space. Then Damien stepped up to the podium. He was a natural, his speech a seamless blend of corporate jargon and filial piety. He spoke of lessons in leadership, of the Thorn DNA of excellence, and how my father had taught his children that a blueprint is a promise. He used the word children in the plural, but his stories were all about him. Victoria's speech was next. It was shorter, more direct, structured like a diagnosis. She praised our father's rigor and discipline, his refusal to accept anything less than perfection. She told a story about how, as a child, she had brought him a school project she'd gotten an A on. He'd taken a red pen and circled the flaws until she understood why it wasn't an A+. The room chuckled appreciatively. I felt a familiar chill. Finally, it was my father's turn. He rose, and a profound silence fell over the room. At 70, he was still a formidable presence, his posture impeccable, his silver hair catching the light. "Thank you," he began, his voice filling the space effortlessly. "When you spend a lifetime building things, you become preoccupied with what will last. Stone, steel, glass, these things have integrity. They endure." He spoke of his career, his philosophy, the city he helped shape. Then his tone grew more personal. "But a man's true legacy is not in the structures he leaves behind. It's in the people who carry his values forward." He turned towards the head table, his expression softening for the first time all night. "Damien, my brilliant successor. Victoria, my steadfast rock. They understand the principles of a strong foundation." The applause started, a warm, rolling tide. He raised his glass to them. And then, he found me. His eyes, clear and unclouded by sentiment, pinned me in my seat. "You can go now, Serafina." The words landed in the sudden, ringing silence. They were not a suggestion, they were a dismissal. The air became heavy, thick with the collective intake of breath of 200 people. I felt their eyes on me, a physical weight. The heat rose in my face, a burning tide of shame. Every cell in my body screamed at me to obey, to make myself small, to vanish as I had been taught to do my entire life. But as I began to push my chair back, another chair moved first. Beside me, Leo stood. The soft scrape of its legs on the floor was like a crack of thunder in the silent room. Leo didn't hesitate. While I sat paralyzed, feeling the architecture of my composure crumble, he rose to his feet with a quiet, unshakable dignity. The entire room, which had been focused on my public execution, now swiveled to face him. My father's expression, once triumphant, hardened into a mask of cold fury. "This is a private family matter," my father said, his voice dangerously low. "Sit down." Leo didn't even look at him. He picked up his water glass, the condensation cool against his fingers, and tapped it gently with a spoon. Ting! The clear, simple sound commanded the room more effectively than any shout could have. "I'd also like to propose a toast," Leo said, his voice calm and even, carrying easily through the tense silence. "To the daughter Marcus Thorne just dismissed." A gasp rippled through the nearest tables. I could feel Damien's stare from across the room, a beam of pure mortification. My father's face was pale with rage. "You have no right." On the contrary, Leo replied, his eyes finally meeting my father's. "I have every right. Because I'm here to talk about legacy too. A different kind." He turned his body slightly, addressing not just my father, but the room of silent witnesses. "You all know Marcus Thorne, the man who builds monuments of steel and glass. Impressive, enduring structures. But Serafina Croft builds something else. She builds refuges." He paused, letting the word land. With no family money, no famous name to open doors, she started a publishing house from her kitchen table. It's called Hearthstone Press. It's dedicated to stories that people like us, he gestured around the opulent room, usually don't have time to hear. The quiet ones, the difficult ones, the ones that teach us empathy. I could see people shifting uncomfortably. This was not on the program. "You talk about foundations, Marcus," Leo continued, his voice gaining a quiet power. "Serafina's foundation isn't concrete. It's courage. It's the courage to keep creating in a world that tells you art is a hobby. It's the courage to see value where you and your world see none." Last year, a poet she discovered, a young woman from Oakland who no one else would publish, was a finalist for the National Book Award. That is a legacy. It's a life changed. My breath hitched in my throat. He remembered the poet's name, the details I'd excitedly told him over dinner months ago. "And let's talk about family legacy," Leo said, his gaze now soft as it found me, but his words were a steel blade aimed at the head table. "When Isabel was dying, it was Serafina who sat with her for hours, reading poetry aloud when she could no longer hold a book. Her brother was closing a deal and her sister was in surgery. Serafina was the one who held her hand. She was the one who showed up. Is that not part of the Thorne legacy? Or does compassion not count on the balance sheet?" A dead, profound silence. He had brought my mother into the room and no one dared to breathe. Even my father was stunned, silenced. Leo raised his glass high. "So I toast Serafina Croft, the builder of bridges between people. The woman who taught me that the strongest structures aren't made of steel, but of kindness, integrity, and love." He looked directly at me then, and the entire room, with all its power and wealth, simply melted away. "You never needed a seat at this table, Serafina. You build your own." He set his glass down, untouched, and reached for my hand. "Let's go home," he whispered. I stood up, my legs shaking but steady. Together, we walked towards the exit. The journey across that room felt 1,000 miles long, but for the first time in my life, I wasn't looking down. I kept my head high. No one spoke. No one moved to stop us. As we passed the last table, an older man, my father's original partner, Arthur Sterling, a man who had once told me I had my mother's gentle eyes, met my gaze and gave me a slow, deliberate nod. It was a small gesture, but it felt like a benediction. Then we were through the doors and into the quiet of the elevator, the sound of 100 whispered conversations sealed behind us. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. We didn't speak on the bridge. The city lights smeared into long, golden trails through the tears that were finally streaming down my face. I wasn't crying from humiliation anymore. It was the gut-wrenching, soul-cleansing sob of a pressure valve being released after a lifetime of being held tight. In the safety of our car, halfway between his world and mine, I was finally letting go. I'm sorry, I choked out, the words tasting of salt and relief. I put you in an impossible position. Leo reached over and took my hand, lacing his fingers through mine. I have never been more proud to be your husband, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Never. I laughed, a broken, watery sound. He'll disown me. He'll write me out of everything. Good, Leo said softly. Then he has nothing left to hold over you. We're free. That night, I mourned. I mourned the father I never had. I mourned the girl who tried so desperately to win his love. I mourned the years I had spent believing his silence was a reflection of my worth. Leo held me through it all, not offering solutions or platitudes, just his quiet, unwavering presence. When the tears finally subsided, I didn't feel empty, as I'd always feared I would. I felt light, scoured clean. The next morning, the inevitable text arrived. It was from my father. Your husband's appalling behavior has caused irreparable damage. You will issue a formal apology to me and to my colleagues, or you will be formally removed from my will and trust. You have 24 hours. I stared at the message on my phone. A year ago, it would have sent me into a spiral of panic. 10 years ago, it would have broken me. But now, I felt a strange and profound calm. It was the final, predictable move of a man whose only tool was control. I showed the text to Leo. He read it, then looked at me, his eyes asking a question. I took a deep breath and deleted the message. Then I blocked his number. A week later, I sat in a comfortable armchair across from a therapist Leo had found, a woman named Dr. Lena Petrova. Her office was warm and filled with plants. It felt like a garden. So, she said with a kind smile, where would you like to begin? And for the first time, I told the whole story. Not the edited, polite version, but the raw, painful, unvarnished truth. It was the beginning of the slow, painstaking work of rebuilding my own foundation. It wasn't a linear process. There were days of anger, days of deep, aching grief, and days where I felt the phantom pull of the old dynamic. But with each session, with every honest conversation with Leo, I was slowly, carefully, drafting a new blueprint for my life. We didn't leave the Bay Area. Running felt like giving him one last victory. Instead, we dug our roots deeper into our own community in Berkeley and Oakland, a vibrant world of artists, activists, academics, and families who defined wealth in terms of connection, not capital. We hosted potlucks in our small backyard, our friends' laughter a much sweeter sound than the polite applause of the gala. A year after that night, Hearthstone Press won the Independent Publisher of the Year award. The ceremony was held in a crowded, noisy room in a repurposed warehouse in Brooklyn. There were no oysters, no champagne, just craft beer in plastic cups and an overwhelming sense of shared purpose. When they called my name, I walked up to the rickety podium, looked out at the sea of friendly, passionate faces, and I felt a sense of belonging so profound it brought tears to my eyes. This was my legacy. It was small and messy and gloriously, entirely my own. My brother, Damien, called me the next day. It was the first time we'd spoken since the gala. I saw the news about the award, he said, his voice hesitant. Congratulations, Serafina. Really? Thank you, Damien. There was a long pause. You know, he said finally, what Leo said that night, about Mom. It stayed with me. We were wrong. It wasn't a perfect apology, but it was a crack in the concrete wall. It was a start. Victoria never called. My father and I never spoke again. The silence between us was no longer a weapon he wielded against me, but a quiet, peaceful space that I had claimed for myself. This evening, I am sitting in my office, a converted sunroom at the back of our house. The walls are lined with books, the air smells of paper and ink, and through the window, I can see Leo planting a new bed of lavender in our garden. I'm proofreading the manuscript of a new novel, a story about a young woman learning to sail, about finding her own way by navigating the wind and the tides. On my desk, beside a stack of submissions, is a framed photo from our wedding day in the Redwood Grove. In it, Leo and I are laughing, my head thrown back, his eyes crinkling at the corners. Sunlight is filtering through the ancient trees, illuminating us in a soft, golden glow. I used to think of my father's house, that cold glass box on the cliff, as my origin story. But I was wrong. This is where my life began. Not in the shadow of a monument built to one man's ego, but here in the light, in the home we built together, a place with no hard lines, only soft landings. A place where I am, finally and completely, the architect.